do a really quick or hopefully brief overview on how to create a new database on Hostgator and connect to it using Node.js. So you're going to start by visiting your rody.dev site, which, for me it's the default, but for you you have some stuff on there. You do /cpanel, enter through the portal, use your username and enter your password. Once you're here, you're going to go to MySQL databases. You'll create a new database. It's always going to be named with your username first and then an underscore. So I can call this sample. I'll create a database. The UI is not very good. And eventually you're going to have to create a new user so that you're able to actually access your database using Node. So I would just go ahead and create it while you're on this page. So all I did was scroll down a little bit. So now you can see I have that sample database that I just created. I'm going to make a new user. I'm going to make my password. I know it is a bad password, but it's just because I'm going to be using it in the video anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and create that user. You can click go back. And I want to scroll all the way down and actually add the user to that database. So the user that I just created is called user. And the database that I want to add it to is VC Chavez sample. If you don't have any other databases, the ones and you don't have any other users, whatever you just created is going to be the default. But since I had some previous users and databases there before, I had to select these. So I'm going to go ahead and select add. And you want to be careful with what privileges you give them, right? So you don't want someone to be able to access the entirety of your database through your page if that's not what they're going to be needing it for. Now for the lab, you're going to need to be able to select. You're going to need to be able to insert, right? So when you create a new user, you have to insert them. And when you try to find to see if there's any user, you have to select it. But there's nothing else that you should really need from here. You're going to create your table ahead of time, so you're not going to do that through the Node.js, and you're not going to be deleting anything. So you should be fine with just doing select and insert. So if you were to enable changing the password, for example, you would need update, but again, since we are not doing that, you just need to select and insert. I'm going to go ahead and make those changes. Wonderful. The last thing you need to do is you need to set up your database so that you can actually access it. And that gets a little tricky. So in theory, you should be able to set it up with specific IP addresses so that only IP addresses that you want can access it. But then you would have to get the IP address of your own computer and figure out what it's being routed through your internet provider. And you'd have to know the IP address that Hostgator is going to be using. So we're going to do something that's not super safe, but for the purposes of our labs is fine. So you're going to go ahead and go back to home. You're going to click on Remote MySQL. You'll see that I already have this access host here. So this wildcard, this % sign serves as a wildcard that says anyone can access my database. Again, not best practice. You would want to give access only directly to specific IP addresses, but so that we don't have to figure out all of the appropriate IP addresses, we can just use the wildcard for now. So when you first load this page, this is not going to be here. So what you would do is you would do % and then click add host, and that would show up here. Important that you know what this IP address is. You're going to need that for later, so you can go ahead and copy that and save it for a rainy day. Actually, let me actually save it before I forget. Okay. All right, so we should be all set here. Now what we can do is we can actually create our table via Hostgator, which will be much easier than trying to create it with Node.js. So you can go ahead and click into PHP My Admin. And it's going to take a little bit of load. So again, for you, you'll only have the database that you just created. For me, I have multiple databases. Keep in mind that a database and a table are different. A database can have multiple tables, and a table is essentially what you can think of as a spreadsheet. So a database is like an Excel workbook, and a table would be a singular sheet, a singular spreadsheet or worksheet, or a single CSV file that belongs to that database. So what I can do is I can go ahead and create a new table here. And the really nice thing is you can do it via the UI, so that if you're not super comfortable doing in the SQL commands, you don't have to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new table and call it my sample table. I'm only going to give it one column. You're going to need more columns, of course, to have all of the user's information, but for the purposes of demonstration, I'm just going to do one column. And then it's going to give you all of this you need to populate all of this information for all of your columns. So since I only did one, I only have to do it for one. So I'm just going to call this ID. It's going to be an integer. Let's say it's a maximum of 3 digits. So that's what this length values is. In this case, I'm going to have this be the primary key. It's also the only key in here, or rather the only column. And we can leave the rest as is and save it. So now what you can do is if you click on SQL, you can simulate what some of these commands are. And it's really nice because you can also click on these guys to see what how to start, right? If you don't remember how to delete, if you don't remember how to insert, you can start and see the query here. You can actually see your database here. If you go to browse, excuse me, I don't have anything in here, but when you do have values, you see I have here ID, and I would populate this in here. So for example, let me insert the value 32. I already inserted it. So it did it from before. So let me also insert 33. Let me do another insert. So you could do inserts either way, right? I could do it via here, and it tells you that one row was inserted. Oh, excuse me. Or you can insert it via here, and then click go to execute the command. So now if I go to browse, I can see my tiny table with 32, 33, 34, 35. All right, so once we have our table set up, and you would presumably start by, you could probably insert one dummy value to be able to test your connection later. So that's why I pre-populated some of these, right? Like for example, if I do a query, I want to make sure that something returns if it's supposed to return. And so having one dummy value in there that you insert via the UI rather than using code is helpful again so that you can test your connection later on. All right, so this is the very first part. I'm going to chop these videos into two. So the first part, how to actually create that database and get it set up so that we can connect it to Node.js later. And in the second video, I'll show you how to connect it with Node.js and actually start doing some queries from the database.